Welcome to today's Explainer. Have you ever stopped to think about how a handful of struggling, freezing settlements on the very edge of an unknown continent somehow transformed into a modern global superpower? And in just 400 years? Well, today we are unpacking this massive story. It's a truly fascinating narrative full of rapid expansion, brutal conflict, relentless innovation, and just continuous, ongoing reinvention. To make sense of it all, we're going to break this epic journey down into 5 distinct chunks: the colonial era, the American Revolution, expansion and the Civil War, the rise to global power, and finally, we'll look at modern America.
All right, let's just jump right into part 1, the colonial era. This is really where the bedrock of a future nation was laid down.
So think back to 1607. That's when the London Company established Jamestown, which was a settlement pretty much driven by sheer economic profit. They were there to make money. But then, just 13 years later, the Pilgrims landed in Plymouth, and their motivation was totally different. They were seeking religious freedom. By the time the province of Georgia was founded a bit later in 1732, the original 13 colonies were fully established. And you can see that from day one, America's DNA was this really fascinating mix. You had people seeking a new relationship with God, right alongside people who were just chasing a dollar. Now get this, between 1625 and 1775, the population skyrocketed from a meager 2,000 people all the way up to 2.4 million in just 150 years. This massive demographic boom was fueled by huge waves of immigration, but also by the grim, growing reality of a system of slavery. And we have to note, this explosive growth largely displaced the existing Native American populations, but from a purely historical standpoint, it built the critical mass needed for the defining century that was right around the corner. And that critical mass brings us perfectly into Era 2, the American Revolution. Tensions with the British Crown were basically about to boil over. There's this quote from Thomas Paine's wildly popular 1776 pamphlet, Common Sense, that really captures the mood. He wrote that ordinary people had the capacity to govern themselves and did not need to be led by a crowned official. Think about how profoundly radical that idea was at the time. The whole concept that ordinary, everyday citizens didn't need a king, it literally flipped the script on human governance. Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke heavily influenced the Founding Fathers here, and they forged these big, abstract concepts into the Declaration of Independence, making the case that individuals possess inherent rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But, this is exactly where the history gets a bit complex. We all know the Declaration of Independence squarely blamed King George III for political oppression, but historical interpretations of the real, underlying causes, they've actually varied wildly over time. Every new generation kind of views the revolution through the lens of their own era. So there really isn't just one simple explanation. Some historians argue it was strictly economic, basically a clash between the survival of English mercantile capitalism and colonial economic freedom. Others look at it as a class struggle against the local, wealthy colonial aristocracy. A third camp argues it was essentially a democratic movement designed to protect existing liberties. And then finally, there's the escalation of distrust theory, which basically says both sides just became so deeply paranoid of one another that it led to a disastrous deadlock. It's a fascinating debate, and it really shapes how we analyze the past. Moving right along to Section 3, Expansion and Civil War. Welcome to the 19th century, which was an era of just incredibly rapid growth, but also a devastating ideological fracture. Driven by this powerful belief in manifest destiny, the U.S. expanded relentlessly across the continent. The 1803 Louisiana Purchase literally tripled the nation's size overnight. Then came a really aggressive push. Texas was incorporated in 1845, the Oregon Territory was secured in 1846, and the Mexican Cession in 1848 brought in California and the Southwest. The Gadsden Purchase in 1853 finally rounded out the lower 48 states. But this relentless expansion forced a terrifying question to the surface. Would these brand new territories be free, or would they allow slavery? By this point, the United States was essentially 2 completely different nations forced to share one border. The North was industrializing incredibly fast, it relied on free labor, and it leaned toward the new Republican Party, which officially pledged to keep slavery out of the Western territories. Meanwhile, the South remained heavily agricultural, completely reliant on the brutal system of slave labor, and was largely influenced by the Democratic Party. So, when Abraham Lincoln won the presidency in 1860, the breaking point arrived. 7 southern slave states immediately seceded. 625,000. That is the staggering number of lives lost during this 4-year conflict. To really put that into perspective for you, that number nearly matches all the American soldiers who died in all other U.S. wars combined. The bloodshed on battlefields from Gettysburg to Antietam was horrific, but it achieved 2 monumental outcomes. It ultimately preserved the United States as one single, indivisible nation, and it led to the total abolition of slavery.
Which leads us into part 4, the rise to global power. As the 20th century dawns, we see the U.S. dramatically abandon its traditional isolationism and step firmly onto the world stage. For a long time, right up until 1898, the U.S. largely just kept to itself. But the Spanish-American War changed everything, leaving the U.S. with its own overseas dependencies. Suddenly, America was a colonial power. Then, in 1917, the U.S. intervened in World War I, essentially tipping the balance of the whole conflict. And of course, following the devastating Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, the U.S. was launched fully into World War II, fundamentally transforming itself into the arsenal of democracy.
The economic impact of all this wartime production was just completely unprecedented. In just a 6-year span, the gross national product more than doubled. It skyrocketed from $91 billion to over $213 billion. This immense industrial mobilization didn't just win a massive global war. It literally annihilated the Great Depression, basically wiped out unemployment, and established the United States as the single largest economy in the entire world. But the Second World War II ended, a brand new struggle immediately kicked off: the Cold War. On one side, you had the US and NATO championing capitalism and a strict policy of containment. On the exact opposite side, the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact were promoting communism and global expansion. This incredibly high-stakes ideological rivalry drove the nuclear arms race. It pushed humanity out into space, and it ignited devastating proxy conflicts in places like Korea and Vietnam. For decades, absolutely every global event was viewed through the lens of this superpower standoff. Well, that massive standoff finally ended in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed, leaving the US as the world's sole remaining superpower. And that brings us to our 5th and final section, modern America. We all know the early 2000s were defined by a single tragic day. The September 11th attacks fundamentally reshaped the nation. It triggered the global war on terror and led to nearly 2 decades of military involvement in Afghanistan and Iraq. Domestically, it prompted massive, sweeping homeland security overhauls. But at the exact same time all of this was happening, the US was also driving a massive global tech boom. The internet and new technologies were radically accelerating globalization, completely changing how human beings communicate, work, and just live their everyday lives.
Yet here's the reality. Despite having unprecedented military and economic dominance on the global stage, modern America is still grappling with some incredibly severe and complex domestic challenges. We're talking about deepening political divides, massive wealth gaps and economic inequality, ongoing national debates over gun violence, and the persistent historical struggle for racial equality and social justice. These are the internal hurdles that are actively testing the resilience of the nation today.
So that leaves us with one absolutely critical question to think about. How will the United States navigate its deepening internal divides while still maintaining its unprecedented status as a global superpower? We've just traced 400 years of constant evolution, brutal conflict, and constant reinvention. How the next chapter of this story unfolds is something we are all going to get to witness firsthand. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, stay curious, and I'll see you next time.